Hey, Phil here with Photography and Friends and Video School Online. Today I have another full photo editing session. This is a monthly challenge that I do in my Photography and Friends Facebook group. We take a photo, we all edit it, and we see what we come up with. So I'm going to head into Lightroom and start editing this photo. I've never really seen it before, aside from downloading it, but I haven't practiced editing it. So this is a full sort of, as if I was looking at this for the very first time, how I would edit a photo. If you're interested in participating in these monthly challenges or other weekly activities and competitions, if you are already in one of our photography courses, go to the first section of the course and we show you how you can join the Photography and Friends community. If you're not already, we encourage you to join one of our courses. And as a bonus for joining one of our courses, you get access to the community and all of these other benefits as well, completely free. Awesome. Let's head into Lightroom and we'll start editing. All right, so here's the photo that we're editing today. It's a free photo provided by wesaturate.com from photographer Anton Collard. So thank you, Anton, for providing great images for us to practice our editing with. So this photo, it's actually interesting. It has it looks actually pretty nice already. I'm assuming this is what it looks like raw because that's what we downloaded it as. But it already has this kind of nice vignette that may have come from the lens. It's got really nice warm tones to it because it looks like it was shot at golden hour. And really, there's not much that you would have to do to make this look like a great looking photo. There's a little bit of overexposure that I'd like to bring down, but because it already looks so good, I want to go a little bit more creative with this shot. So I think I'm going to go for more of like a vintagey vibe, just the way she's dressed, that hat, just with colors and the tones. I'm going to try to make it a little bit more vintage. So the first things I always do when I edit photos is to crop it, just so I don't have to worry about anything outside of the crop that I might be adjusting exposure to or colors to. And so I'm just going to crop up like this. I kind of like her centered, but maybe a little bit to the right. I'm not going to use like the rule of thirds completely like that, but just her because she's looking to the left side of the photo frame. I want to have a little bit more negative space over there on that side. So something like this. There is something about that hat. While it's very cool, it's big and it kind of distracts. So if I crop in too much, that hat becomes even a bigger part of the story, which I'm not a huge fan of right now. So that crop looks pretty good. Next, I just go through my basic tone and presence adjustments. So over here, I'm using Lightroom. You can use anything to edit your photo if you're following this along with another photo editing app. Generally, I skip exposure and contrast and move straight to the individual sliders for highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So the highlights or the whites are definitely a little bit too bright. We can see in the histogram up here, lots in the highlights and whites. So I'm going to bring down the highlights first and see how much information we're already getting back in her dress. That's the power of RAW. I always like to point that out, that with a RAW photo, you get so much room to edit. Now I'm also going to bring down my whites. When you bring down the whites too much, sometimes it can look a little bit muted or dull in terms of overall exposure. So you got to be careful, but with this photo, it looks pretty good when I bring them down, something like that. With the shadows, I might boost the shadows just a little bit. I kind of like how we get a little bit more detail in her hair. If you want to go more contrasty, bring down the shadows, but I'm going to boost the shadows. I'm actually trying to flatten this image out a little bit in terms of exposure, and that will help it look a little bit more of that sort of vintage look. I'm going to also bring up the blacks to basically do the same, get a little bit more of a flatter profile. And when I do that, everything looks a little bit too bright to me, to my eye. And so I'm going to bring down the overall exposure just a smidge. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let's zoom in here. So much detail. Eye is perfectly in focus. That hair is pretty awesome too. With a lot of portraits, what I'll do is just decrease the clarity just a little bit overall, just to soften kind of the edges of things, soften the skin. We can go in with an adjustment brush and do that too if we want. Dehaze, I'm not going to touch with a portrait. Vibrance, this is also something that I might bring down, or maybe the overall saturation, just to get rid of some of the color. Although I like the color, if I'm going for something a little bit more vintagey, I'm going to go a little bit more desaturated. So that's what I do with these main options. If I move up to color temperature, it is so warm, so I'm kind of curious what would happen if I bring down the warmth just a little bit, make it a little bit cooler. Here, it would be difficult. I'm guessing that her dress or the hat is sort of a pure white, but if I go here, I'm guessing it's going to turn really blue. Now, something closer to that, let's go to her little, yeah, no, that's going to be way too blue. So something closer to that might look a little bit natural if like you were perfectly lit with just in a general setting, not with the golden light of the sunset or sunrise, whatever this is. Looks like, I'm going to guess sunset. But I do like a little bit though of the warmth. If I double click there, that's what it was shot at naturally. Looks a little bit too much. As I go along, I like to see the before and after. So you can press the backslash button on your keyboard to see the before and after really quickly. You can see how much contrast there is in the original photo. It's almost like I'm kind of making it more of a natural looking photo, a raw photo, and then this could be someone's edit. It's funny how this raw photo ended up. I'm not sure what camera this was shot on actually, so but it did come out pretty contrasty and saturated straight from camera. So I'm happy with that. I leave the tone curve myself for the end to just add any contrast or play with the tone at the very end after I make all of my other adjustments. In terms of color or HSL, I might play around with this a little bit, but I think I'm going to start with my split toning colors to see what I can do to get more of a vintagey vibe. So for the highlights, let's go actually to green, and let's just see what happens if I bring up the saturation of the green. So with hue split toning, basically what I'm doing is I'm adding a specific hue or color to the highlights versus the shadows. I just feel like something like green. Actually, that blue is kind of nice. See, I'm just playing with this. Actually, I kind of like the blue in the highlights. Something like that, that purple, magenta. And then with the shadows, maybe more of like a yellow, green. Okay, so see how we're getting more of a feeling? Again, let's go back, or not back, but just see the before and after. We can also just specifically turn off the split toning with this button right here. See how it's starting to give a little bit of a feeling or a vibe just with the colors, that vintagey vibe that I'm going for. And this is like some colors that you would get from different film stocks. Okay, that's pretty cool. If I do want any specific colors to pop out, I might use the HSL panel up here. So if I go to HSL and if I want to make a color brighter, or not brighter, but more colorful, more saturated, I would go to saturation. And then I can click this little, it's like an eyedropper button where I can click this and then go to my photo and find a specific color and increase or decrease it. So see how I picked that belt thing that she's wearing? It brings up a lot of the reds and oranges as I bring this up. Now I don't want to go too far because there are so many red and orange tones or colors in her skin, and I don't want to oversaturate that. So I might just go straight into the red itself and boost that. And the nice thing about that is it's also boosting her lips too, her lipstick, and some of the pink in her shirt. I might go in here and try to boost just some of this teal or aqua. So we got that green. I see it's bringing up the green and the aqua. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll use that color picker to find the specific color, and then I'll go back and just adjust the sliders myself. Now, if we wanted to desaturate the blue sky, for example, which would also desaturate what's in her dress, we can go do that. And that would kind of focus the attention more on her. That's kind of cool too. See, this is where I'm just having fun. I kind of like where that ended up, but I also want to see with a little bit of desaturation, but I also want to see with the hue actually changing the color. So if I take the hue picker for the sky, make it more green, purple. I don't like the purple. Nah, I'm going to undo that. So I'm going to leave that as is. But I'm really starting to like how this is turning out. So very subtle color adjustments, and I know it's probably harder for you to see on just the video, but starting to get a cool vibe there. All right, for the detail, everything looks really sharp. I'm not too worried about the sharpening, so I'm just going to leave the original sharpening. There really isn't that much noise. We can see what happens if I boost the noise reduction. Cleans up a little bit, but I don't mind actually. There's not really much noise, so I'm not going to add noise reduction, which kind of just softens everything and blurs it a little bit. Lens corrections, I'm just going to leave that as is. Transformation, I'm going to leave as is. Effects, sometimes I like to add a very feathered vignette, but I think for this one, I'm just going to leave it as is. No vignette, no grain, no nothing like that. All right, so those are all of the basic edits that I would do. And then I would start to look at some more brushes or specific edits with the radial filters or the graduated filters. So I'm just gonna, with any portrait, I like to just see if there's anything I can do to their face to make their eyes or their lips pop. The problem with this photo is that her hair is it's like all over the place. So it would take a lot of time to go in, kind of paint over her hair and select her hair to make an edit to it. There is one thing we could do, which is if we want to just adjust her hair and see what we could do with it, I'm going to use the brush adjustment. I'm going to turn off, I'm going to turn off auto mask actually, and I'm just going to paint over. Let's turn on our show selected mask overlay. Now see, I'm not worrying that I'm getting her eyes and face as well, because what I'm going to do now is turn on a range mask for color. Color or luminance. Color allows me to pick a specific color out of my selection and see how when I click that eyedropper and click her hair, it tries to do a good job just selecting her hair. It's also going to select some of her eye as well, but that's okay. I might want the adjustments that I'm going to make to her hair also to apply to her eye. And then you could adjust how strong or kind of blended or specific this selection is with this slider. All right, so now what am I going to do with it? Well, if I want a little bit more detail in her hair, we can boost the shadows even more. Maybe make it a little bit more contrasty just to give some more shadow. Make it a little bit more intense, and also maybe with the clarity, bring some detail as well. Interesting, just seeing what the dehaze does. If we want to change like the color or just the hue a little bit, we can make it a little bit warmer or a little bit cooler with the temperature slider. We can also add color to it. So see, this isn't going to change her from a brunette to a blonde, but you can kind of add a little bit of subtle color to it. Now, I'm not going to do that though. I'm going to leave her hair color as is. Now, if I take the overall exposure slider, you can see, again, how much detail you can show if you want to get super creative. You can do that. But really, I think I just want to make her hair a little bit more contrasty. All right, so if I click done, actually, let's go back to that brush and let's see what it is with it off and undo. Just subtle things, just subtle things. There we go, cool. All right, so now let's again go back into her face. We're going to try to make her eyes pop a little bit. Now, her eyes are pretty small in the frame, but if we could do a little bit to just make them pop a little bit more, it might help. So I'm again going to take my adjustment brush. I'm going to make this size a little bit smaller. Turn on my show overlays. All right. It's looking pretty good. Now for range masks, I am going to do luminance, and I'm going to not include some of the highlights, which are probably some of the whites of her eyes. So more just, I just want like the browns. And if I want to get in there really precisely, I can take my eraser and just make sure I'm just getting her iris, which is what I'm trying to edit right now. So with an iris, what I'll sometimes do is I'll just boost the clarity. It's kind of hard to see because my little dot's right there, but you can see that it gets a little bit more detailed. Her pupil gets a little bit darker, which is going to make it pop. I also will boost the saturation. And here's where I might play with the color. I want it to be red. Sometimes adding a little blue can actually make it a little bit darker, which is nice. Let's get rid of that color actually. Again, just playing around sometimes. Overall exposure or contrast, we can boost the contrast. Highlights, let's see what happens if I, not much. Not much with the shadows either. Whites does a little bit. Dehaze does a little bit as well. So let's just click done. I actually think that does a little bit. Now what we could also do is paint, basically kind of paint on a darker pupil. Now you gotta be careful with this, but I'm just gonna take a really tiny brush right over her pupil. There. Make it darker. Whew, no way. That's gonna look too crazy. I think it was a little bit too big. I think I'm using that same brush from before. Okay, click a new one. Start over here. Let's make it super small. And if we make it a little bit darker, it's going to make her eyes pop even more. Now, when I'm zoomed in, I think I got it in the wrong location, but zoomed out, you can kind of see it's so hard for you to see. I know it is. I can barely see myself. Okay, that might have gone a little bit too far. I'm going to delete that, but that is one sort of technique you can do to make someone's eyes pop, is just to make their pupil dark compared to the rest of their iris or the whites of their eyes. Speaking of the whites of her eyes, I'm going to do a little brush over that as well and try to make them a little bit whiter. I know there's not much that you can kind of see here. Show our overlays so we can see where we're actually brushing on. And generally, I would probably pay attention more to this if it was a closer up image. I'm going to choose luminance, and this time I'm going to just select the highlights. So that's really just selecting some of the whites of her eye. Erase this over here, make sure I'm not getting her eyelash. And now I'm just going to desaturate just a little bit. And also boost the exposure just a little bit. If you go too far, it starts to look super fake. I think it made it pop just a little bit. Let's do the same with her lips. So I'm going to take the brush. This time I am going to turn on auto mask. And that's going to help my brush just select her lips and not her teeth as much. All right, that's pretty good. Now, you'll see what I did and you're like, whoa, Phil, that lipstick looks crazy. That's just the selection. Now, if I turn that off, we can add a little bit of magenta and boost the saturation. You could also go into the color, and here's where you can really change the color of her lipstick. Go something crazy, purple, blue, add some green. I'm just going to add a little bit of pink. Ooh, way too much. All right, so that really makes her lips pop. So let's undo that. Let's delete that. See the before and after. Makes them pop pretty good. All right, so that's pretty much all I would do. Sometimes I would maybe take a brush. We got a new brush again. We're going to paint over her cheeks and her forehead. And here's where I would just get rid of a little bit of the detail. This just softens the skin just a little bit. Looks pretty good. And we're just going to decrease the clarity. See how if I go super crazy, it like really softens it up. I don't want to go too crazy. And also because her hair is kind of going through, you got to be careful. Just painting over right here near the corner of her eye. Okay, so I still have the clarity all the way up, and I'm just going to bring that down just a little bit. So it just softens those details just a little bit. Now, this isn't something that I generally do with a lot of my portraits. I like my portraits to be pretty natural, but this is a common technique in retouching portraits. It's just softening that skin a little bit. Again, just trying to make some of her facial features a little bit pronounced. Let's just go over her eyebrows really quickly. We are going to leave auto mask on. Just brush over, see what's selected. We're definitely going to want to use a luminance mask here. So range mask, luminance, and we're just scrolling down or using the bottom just to select some of that brown. Or maybe let's try the color masks. And let's pick that color right there. See what it does. That's pretty good. Now let's turn off our mask overlay. Let's decrease our shadows. Okay, overall exposure, if we bring that down, her eyebrows do get a little bit darker, which when we zoom out, makes it a little bit too pronounced. So let's go back in here, bring that up just a little bit. There we go. That's looking pretty good. All right, overall, I'm pretty happy with this. Now, as you can see, I can continue to play around with this and do all kinds of things, but I think I'm gonna leave it at there. Now, I just go back to my overall tone curve, and here's where I decide. Do I want to add back a little bit of contrast with an S curve? Do I want to get rid of some contrast, make it a little flatter with, I guess that's not really a Z curve, but the opposite of an S curve? And that's just kind of my final adjustments to see what I want to do. That's pretty good. Now let's look at the before and after. Let's go side by side, before and after. I don't know. I think it looks pretty good. Honestly, I think like I said earlier, this original image probably is something that looks more natural compared to this one on the left, which is very contrasty, and the colors are much more saturated. If I want to, I'm just trying to see what I could do to make it even more sort of vintagey. So I'm going to make it a little bit more aqua, boost that saturation for the highlights and the shadows. Boost the saturation even more. Just kind of getting a cool filter there. Ooh, a little bit too much though. There we go. That's kind of like a cool warm tone to this, but it's not just like a warmth. It's got some green in it. I'm kind of back where I started. I go down one way and then I'm like, wait a minute, Phil, I don't like that. Let's just see what the tint does. Interesting. Yeah, you could do all kinds of stuff with this. Cool. All right, there's also some profiles if you want to go in here. This is a new feature of Lightroom. In the main settings, if you click on this little button down here, you have some preset sort of filters. So if you want to just change the colors themselves, we got some vintage filters down here. So here we have like vintage 1, vintage 2, vintage 3. These are just changing the colors themselves. It's not really changing the tone at all, but just the color and how it processes the color. I kind of like vintage 1 and vintage 2. Vintage 1 is kind of what I was going for, but a little bit more contrasty than mine. Anyways, just wanted to show you those if you want a quick way to add and change the colors of your image. All right, thank you so much for watching. Again, if you want to participate in these kinds of activities, each month we have an editing challenge that you can participate in the Photography and Friends Facebook group. It's a community for all of the students of our photography courses. So if you are already enrolled in one of our photography courses, there are instructions for how to join the group at the beginning of the course. So check that out. If you aren't in any of our courses, please check out our photography courses, which are great standalone, but also you get this community of beginner photographers helping each other out as well. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in another video in the future.